So before we begin, wherever you are right now, listening in the dark or maybe half light, maybe under blankets or walking somewhere quiet, I want you to do something for me. Type in the comments where you're listening from. Just the city, the country, wherever you are in the world right now. And while you're down there, tell me what topic you want me to dive into next. Because apparently my job now is to ruin your childhood memories of everything you thought was innocent. Chocolate, teddy bears, probably rainbows next week. Now, let me ask you something. When you think of Cadbury, what comes to mind? Purple, right? That specific royal purple. Maybe the dairy milk bar with a glass and a half logo. Quakers, formerly called the Religious Society of Friends, were a Christian group that believed in a few very unusual things for the 1800s. They believed every person had a direct relationship with God, no priests needed. They believed in silence, in simplicity, in nonviolence. They refused to swear oaths. They refused to join the military. They dressed plainly. And here's the part that's going to define everything we talk about tonight. They believed in something called testimonies. Not the courtroom kind, the life kind. Testimonies were moral principles you didn't just believe, you lived. Every single day, in how you did business, how you treated employees, how you made money. You couldn't exploit people and call yourself a good Quaker. You couldn't lie in advertising. You couldn't pay starvation wages and then go to meeting on Sunday and sit in holy silence pretending your hands were clean. For Quakers, business wasn't separate from morality. It was morality. And John Cadbury looked around Birmingham in 1824 and saw a problem he thought he could solve with commerce. People were drinking themselves to death. So he opened a shop, not a pub, not a pharmacy, a tea and coffee shop. Because John Cadbury genuinely believed that if working people had access to affordable tea and coffee, warm drinks that didn't destroy their minds and bodies, they might stop drinking gin. He thought he could save lives by selling beverages. And laugh if you want, it sounds naive now, but he wasn't entirely wrong. Tea and coffee were still expensive, still mostly for the rich. And Cadbury started selling them to working-class families at prices they could almost afford. He also sold something else. Cocoa. Not chocolate bars. Not candy. Cocoa. As in drinking chocolate. A bitter, gritty powder you mix with hot water or milk. It was marketed as a health drink. An alternative to alcohol. Something nutritious. Something pure. The shop did well. Well enough that John brought in his brother, Benjamin. Well enough that by 1831, they weren't just selling cocoa, they were manufacturing it. And that's where the story really begins. Because once you start manufacturing something, you're not just a shopkeeper anymore. You're an employer. You have workers. And in 1831, in industrial England, that meant you had power over human lives in ways that were legal, common, and absolutely brutal. Most factory owners worked children 12, 14, 16 hours a day, paid them almost nothing, housed them in slums, let them get sick, let them die, replace them. John and Benjamin Cadbury were Quakers. They couldn't do that. Not wouldn't. Couldn't. Because if you exploited a child to make your profit, you weren't living your testimony. You were a hypocrite in the eyes of God, and worse, in the eyes of every other Quaker who knew you. So from the very beginning, the Cadbury brothers ran their factory differently. They paid fair wages. They didn't employ children under 13, which was radical. They gave workers Sundays off. They kept the workday shorter than the legal maximum. Not because the law required it, because their faith did. And guess what happened? They almost went bankrupt. Because it turns out, when you pay people fairly and don't work them into early graves, your operating costs go up. And when your competitors are doing the opposite, working people 14-hour days and paying them in tokens they can only spend at the company store, they can sell cheaper than you. For decades, Cadbury barely survived. John's health collapsed. He handed the business to his sons, Richard and George, in 1861. And those two young men, both in their 20s, both Quakers, both idealistic and possibly insane, looked at a failing cocoa business and said, "We're going to double down. Not on profit, on principle." They believed, truly believed, that if they made a better product, treated people better, and refused to cut corners, the business would survive. They were wrong. For a while. But then they went to the Netherlands, saw a new invention called the cocoa press, which removed cocoa butter and created a smoother, purer drinking chocolate, and brought the technology back to England. They rebranded. They created Cadbury Cocoa Essence, the first unadulterated cocoa in Britain. No choke, no flour, no brick dust, which yes, other companies were adding. It sold. It sold so well that by 1879, the Cadbury brothers had a problem. They'd outgrown their factory. They needed a bigger space. And here's where most companies would have just bought a larger building in the same industrial part of town, crammed more workers in, kept costs low, kept growing. But George Cadbury had a different idea. He bought a massive piece of land, miles outside Birmingham, in the countryside, near a place called Bourneville. And he said, "We're going to build a factory inside a garden. Not around a garden, inside one. And we're going to build a village next to it where our workers can live in houses with gardens of their own." People thought he was delusional. But in 1879, construction began. And what rose out of that green English field wasn't just a chocolate factory. It was an idea made brick and mortar. The idea that a company could care for the people who made its products. That profit and dignity didn't have to be enemies. That you could build something beautiful and still make money. For 130 years, that idea survived. And then in 2010, it was sold for £11.9 billion. And everything George Cadbury built, everything his family protected, everything that made Cadbury different from every other corporation on Earth was dismantled in slow motion. Not with explosions, with spreadsheets. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the beginning, back to a time when people still believed a business could have a conscience. Most people, if they know anything about Cadbury beyond the chocolate itself, know it as a feel-good story. A nice British brand, family-owned for generations. Something about a village, something about caring for workers. Very quaint, very Victorian. The kind of thing you mention in a business ethics class as a charming historical footnote before moving on to real companies, modern companies, companies that matter now. And then in 2010, it got bought by Kraft, which was sad, sure, but that's just business, right? That's globalization. That's the market. These things happen. That's the version most people have inherited. The polite version. The version that makes it sound like Cadbury was a sweet old relic that simply couldn't compete in a modern world. So it gracefully accepted a buyout and everyone moved on. But that version, the one you probably walked into this video with, is wrong in almost every way that matters. Because Cadbury wasn't struggling when it was sold. It was profitable, growing. One of Britain's most beloved brands. The Dairy Milk Bar was the best-selling chocolate in the UK. Cadbury had operations in over 60 countries. It wasn't failing. It was devoured. Not because it was weak, because it was valuable. And more importantly, because it had spent 130 years being run in a way that made shareholders, the modern kind, deeply uncomfortable. See, there's this story we tell ourselves about capitalism. A clean story. The story goes like this. Companies that treat workers well, that build good products, that operate with integrity, those companies succeed. The market rewards virtue. The good guys win. And Cadbury is held up, even now, as proof of that story. Look, people say, look at Cadbury, a Quaker family business that paid fair wages and built a village for workers and still became wildly successful. See, capitalism works. You can be good and profitable. But here's the thing they don't tell you. Cadbury survived for 130 years not because the market rewarded its values, but because it was privately controlled by a family that refused to abandon them. The moment that control ended, the moment Cadbury became a publicly traded company fully subject to shareholder pressure, the clock started ticking. It took less than 20 years. From going public in 1962 to being acquired in 2010. In corporate terms, that's nothing. And the acquisition wasn't a rescue. It wasn't a merger of equals. It was hostile. Cadbury's board fought it. The British public protested. Politicians got involved. Workers begged the government to block it. And Kraft bought it anyway. Then immediately broke their first promise. Closed a factory, cut costs, and began the slow work of turning Cadbury into just another brand in a portfolio of brands, no different from Oreo or Philadelphia cream cheese. So let's be very clear about what the familiar version gets wrong. First, Cadbury wasn't some small artisan chocolatier that couldn't scale. By 2010, it was a multinational corporation worth over £12 billion. It had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, sugar rationing, and a dozen recessions. It knew how to compete. Second, the sale wasn't inevitable. It was fought, fiercely. But British takeover laws and shareholder pressure made it almost impossible to resist once Kraft offered enough money. Third, what made Cadbury special wasn't that it was British. It was that it had been built and protected by people who believed a company should serve more than its investors, that it owed something to its workers, its community, the land it sat on. And that belief, that entire moral framework, didn't come from capitalism. It came from religion. Specifically, it came from a faith tradition that most people today have never even heard of. Quakerism. Now, you might be thinking, okay, sure, they were religious. Lots of business owners were religious, so what? But Quaker business ethics weren't like other Christian business ethics. Most Christian entrepreneurs in the 1800s believed God rewarded hard work with wealth. If you were rich, it was because God favored you. Poverty was a moral failing. So you could pay workers almost nothing, work them until they broke, and still sleep soundly because, hey, that's God's plan. Quakers didn't believe that at all. Quakers believed that every human being carried the divine light within them. That meant a factory worker had the same sacred worth as a factory owner. You couldn't exploit someone and claim you were living a godly life. You couldn't look at suffering you had the power to prevent and call it someone else's problem. If you ran a business, you were responsible for the people in it, not just legally, morally, spiritually, before God. And if that sounds extreme, it was. Most businesses in Victorian England were not run this way. Children worked in coal mines, in textile mills, in factories where they lost fingers, lungs, years of life. Workers lived in slums owned by the same people who employed them, paying rent that kept them perpetually in debt. There were no weekends, no pensions, no safety regulations, no concept of a living wage. If you got sick, you were fired. If you complained, you were replaced. And this wasn't some rare cruelty. This was normal, standard, legal, the way business was done. And into that world, the Cadbury family said, no, not because it was profitable, because it was right. And here's the part that the feel-good version leaves out. It almost destroyed them, multiple times. When John Cadbury handed the business to his sons, Richard and George, in 1861, the company was failing. losing money, buried in debt. And the smart business move, the move any reasonable advisor would have recommended, was to cut costs. Pay workers less. Work them harder. Use cheaper ingredients. Add fillers to the cocoa like everyone else was doing. Richard and George refused. They borrowed money, refinanced, took personal risks, and they went the opposite direction. They invested in better machinery, better ingredients, better quality control. They kept wages stable even when they couldn't afford it. And for years, it didn't work. They were on the edge of collapse for most of the 1860s. But then in 1866, they discovered the Dutch cocoa press, a new piece of technology that let them remove cocoa butter from cocoa beans, creating a purer, smoother drinking chocolate. They brought the press back to England, and in 1869, they launched Cadbury Cocoa Essence, the first completely pure cocoa in Britain. No flour, no sugar, no choke, no potato starch, just cocoa. And they advertised it that way. Absolutely pure. Therefore best. It was a direct attack on every other cocoa company in England, all of whom were adding cheap fillers and calling it cocoa. And it worked. Sales exploded. By the 1870s, Cadbury was growing faster than they could manage. They needed a new factory. And this is where George Cadbury made the decision that would define the company for the next century. He didn't just want a bigger building. He wanted to prove something. He wanted to prove that you could build a factory that didn't destroy the people who worked in it, that you could create wealth without creating misery, that a company could be a force for good. And the way to prove that, he believed, was to build a factory somewhere green, somewhere with air and light and space, and to build a village next to it where workers could live in dignity. So in 1879, George bought 14 acres of land in a rural area a few miles south of Birmingham, a place near the Bourne Brook. He called it Bourneville. And what he built there wasn't just revolutionary. It was borderline utopian. But we need to be very careful here, because this is where the story gets romanticized, where it gets turned into a fairy tale. The truth is more complicated. Bourneville wasn't perfect. It wasn't some socialist paradise. George Cadbury was still a capitalist. He still owned the factory. He still made profit. But he ran it according to a set of principles that made other factory owners think he was insane. At Bourneville, every worker had access to green space. There were gardens, sports fields, a bowling green, later, swimming pools, medical facilities, a school. The working day was shorter than the legal maximum. There were breaks, breaks, meal breaks. Workers could sit in the sun during lunch. They weren't locked inside. They weren't searched when they left. They were trusted. And the village that George built next to the factory, this is important, wasn't company housing in the usual sense. Most company housing in the 1800s was a trap. You rented from your employer. If you got fired, you were also evicted. Rent was high. Conditions were terrible. You were paid just enough to survive, and the rent took most of it back. It was a system designed to keep workers dependent. Bourneville was the opposite. The houses were well built, spacious. Each one had a garden, front and back. Rent was capped at a maximum of 1/10 of a worker's income. And here's the part that's easy to miss. George didn't build Bourneville to make money off rent. He built it because he believed bad housing was killing people, physically and morally. He believed that if people lived in clean homes with access to nature, they would be healthier, happier, better parents, better workers, better humans. And he was right. Infant mortality in Bourneville was half the national average. Life expectancy was higher. Workers stayed longer, worked harder, not because they were forced to, because they wanted to, because they weren't being slowly destroyed. And Cadbury, the company, grew. By 1900, It was one of the largest chocolate manufacturers in the world. But the version of the story you've probably heard stops there. Happy ending. Good people won. Except that's not where the story ends. Because George Cadbury didn't just want Bournville to succeed. He wanted it to be a model. He wanted other companies to copy it. He wrote about it, spoke about it, opened Bournville to journalists, politicians, social reformers. He genuinely believed that if he could prove a caring company could be profitable, others would follow. And some did. Other Quaker businesses, Roundtree, Fry, they built similar villages. But most didn't, because most factory owners looked at Bournville and didn't see a model. They saw a threat. If workers started expecting gardens and pensions and decent housing, what would that do to profits? If the public started believing companies had responsibilities beyond shareholders, what would that do to control? Bournville was dangerous, not because it failed, because it succeeded, and for 100 years, the Cadbury family defended it. Through wars, recessions, market crashes, they refused to abandon the principles that built it. But they couldn't defend it forever, because in 1962, Cadbury merged with Schweppes and went public. And once you go public, you don't answer to family anymore. You answer to markets. And markets don't care about principles. Let's go back further now. Before the factory, before the village, before chocolate was even chocolate. Because if you want to understand how Cadbury became what it was, you need to understand what chocolate was before it became a candy bar. And what it was for most of human history was a drink. A bitter, sacred, intoxicating drink. The word chocolate comes from the Nahuatl word zacatl, which the Aztecs used to describe a beverage made from ground cacao beans, water, chili, and sometimes maize. It wasn't sweet. It was thick, frothy, and intensely bitter. And it wasn't for everyone. Cacao was valuable, sacred, reserved for elites, warriors, priests. The Aztecs believed cacao was a gift from Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god. They used cacao beans as currency. A turkey cost 100 beans, a rabbit 30. You could buy a slave for 100 beans, which tells you how valuable cacao was and how horrifying their economy was. When the Spanish arrived in the 1500s, they encountered this drink and initially hated it. Too bitter. But they noticed something. The Aztec elites drank it constantly. It gave energy, stamina. So the Spanish started drinking it too. And because they were European and couldn't handle anything that wasn't aggressively sweet, they added sugar. Cane sugar, which they were already producing in nightmarish quantities using enslaved labor in the Caribbean. Sweetened chocolate became a luxury drink in Spain first, then spread to the rest of Europe. By the 1600s, chocolate houses were opening in London, Paris, Amsterdam. Places where aristocrats gathered to drink thick, sweet, expensive hot chocolate and gossip. It was a status symbol. If you could afford chocolate, you were someone. But it was still just a drink. No bars. No candy. No solid form. That didn't come until the 1800s. And it didn't happen by accident. It happened because of industrialization, chemistry, and a race between European chocolate makers to turn a luxury drink into a product they could sell to millions. The breakthrough came in 1828. A Dutch chemist named Coenraad van Houten invented the cocoa press. This machine could squeeze most of the cocoa butter out of roasted cacao beans, leaving behind a dry cake that could be ground into a fine powder. That powder, mixed with water or milk, made a much smoother drinking chocolate than anyone had tasted before. But here's the key part. The cocoa butter that was removed didn't just disappear. It could be saved and mixed back into cocoa powder along with sugar. And when you did that, you got something new, something solid. Eating chocolate. The first chocolate bar, in the modern sense, was created in 1847 by a British company called Fry's. Joseph Fry and his sons figured out how to mix cocoa powder, sugar, and cocoa butter into a paste that could be molded and hardened. They called it eating chocolate. It was gritty, bitter, barely sweet, but it was revolutionary. For the first time in history, you didn't need to brew chocolate. You could carry it, store it, eat it anywhere. And by the 1850s, British chocolate companies were in a race. Fry's, Rowntree, Cadbury, all trying to make better chocolate, smoother chocolate, cheaper chocolate, all Quaker families, by the way. That's not a coincidence. Quakers couldn't hold public office in Britain because they refused to swear oaths. They couldn't attend universities because those required religious oaths too. So they went into business. And because their faith demanded honesty and fair dealing, they built reputations for quality. If a Quaker sold you something, you could trust it. No lies, no cheating, no adulteration. And in an era when food companies routinely added poison to their products, chalk to bread, lead to candy, that mattered. So by the time John Cadbury opened his tea and coffee shop in Birmingham in 1824, he was entering a trade already associated with Quaker integrity. He sold tea, coffee, drinking cocoa. The cocoa was imported, expensive, mostly purchased by middle-class families. It was still a luxury, but John Cadbury marketed it differently. He didn't sell it as indulgence. He sold it as temperance, as a moral alternative to alcohol. He genuinely believed that if working-class men drank cocoa instead of gin, they'd be healthier, kinder, better fathers. He printed pamphlets, gave talks. He wasn't just selling a product. He was selling a vision of a better society. And it worked, sort of. His shop did well enough that he started manufacturing his own cocoa. By 1831, John Cadbury had a factory. A small one, just a few workers, but a factory. And that's where the moral experiment really began. Because once you employ people, you have power over them. In 1831, that power was nearly absolute. There were no labor laws, no minimum wage, no maximum working hours. Children as young as 5 worked in factories. Workers were injured, sick, exhausted, underpaid, and had no recourse. If they complained, they were fired. If they tried to organize, they were blacklisted. The Industrial Revolution had created extraordinary wealth, but it was built on human suffering so widespread, so normalized, that most people didn't even see it as suffering. It was just the cost of progress. And John Cadbury, a 29-year-old Quaker shopkeeper turned manufacturer, looked at that system and said, I can't participate in this. Not won't. Can't. Because if he exploited workers, he wasn't living his faith. He was betraying it. So from the very beginning, Cadbury workers were treated differently. They were paid weekly in cash, not tokens. They worked shorter hours than the legal maximum. They had Sundays off. John didn't employ children under 13, which was radical. And he didn't just see them as workers. He saw them as souls, as people with the same divine worth as him. And that belief, that seemingly simple belief, would shape every decision Cadbury made for the next 130 years, but also almost bankrupted them. Because here's the thing about running a business ethically in an unethical system. You can't compete on price. Your costs are higher. Your margins are thinner. And if your competitors have no scruples, they will undercut you every single time. By the 1850s, John Cadbury was struggling. His health was failing. The business was losing money. In 1861, he retired and handed the company to his sons, Richard and George Cadbury, 25 and 21 years old, and they inherited a failing business, crushing debt, and a father's reputation for integrity they refused to betray. most people would have cut corners. It doubled down. Now I need to talk about something uncomfortable, something the Cadbury family spent decades trying to avoid talking about. Because here's the truth. You can't tell the story of chocolate without telling the story of slavery. And you can't tell the story of Cadbury without confronting the fact that even the most ethical chocolate company in Britain was still buying cacao grown by enslaved people. Let's be precise about the timeline here. When John Cadbury started selling cocoa in 1824, slavery was still legal in the British Empire. It wasn't abolished until 1833. And even after abolition, even after Britain congratulated itself for ending the trade, cacao production in the Caribbean, in South America, in Africa, was still built on forced labor, just under different names. Indentured servitude, debt bondage, colonial labor systems, same violence, different paperwork. And British chocolate companies, all of them, Cadbury included, were buying cacao from these systems because there was no other supply. Now, here's where it gets complicated. The Cadbury family were Quakers. Quakers were abolitionists. They were some of the earliest, loudest opponents of slavery in Britain. They ran the Underground Railroad. They published anti-slavery pamphlets. They refused to use sugar produced by enslaved people, even when that was almost all the sugar available. They had a whole movement called the Free Produce Movement, where Quakers would only buy goods that weren't tainted by slavery. And yet, Cadbury bought cacao from slave economies for decades because they didn't have a choice, or at least that's what they told themselves. If they refused to buy slave-grown cacao, they couldn't make chocolate. If they couldn't make chocolate, they couldn't run the business. If they couldn't run the business, they couldn't employ people ethically. So they justified it. They told themselves they were doing the best they could in a broken system, that they were treating their workers well, even if they couldn't control the entire supply chain. And for a while, maybe that was true. But then, in the late 1800s, something happened that the Cadbury family could not ignore. Cacao production exploded in West Africa, specifically in São Tomé and Príncipe, two Portuguese-controlled islands off the coast of Central Africa. And the cacao plantations that were being worked by enslaved Africans, not in some abstract historical sense. Right now, 1890s, 1900s, people were being kidnapped from Angola, shipped to the islands, and forced to work cacao plantations under conditions so brutal that most died within a few years. And European chocolate companies, including Cadbury, were buying that cacao because it was cheap, high quality, abundant. In 1900, a journalist named Henry Nevinson traveled to São Tomé and published a series of reports exposing the conditions. He called it slavery because it was. And suddenly, Cadbury had a problem. They were Quakers, abolitionists, moral exemplars, and they were buying chocolate made by enslaved people. The public wanted answers. So did other Quakers. George Cadbury, who by this point was running the company and had spent decades building Bournville as a model of ethical industry, was horrified. He sent investigators to São Tomé. He pressured the Portuguese government to reform. He tried to organize a boycott of São Tomé cacao among British chocolate makers. But here's the thing. He didn't stop buying it. Not immediately. For years, Cadbury kept purchasing São Tomé cacao while publicly saying they were working on the problem. And in 1909, a British missionary named William Cadbury, yes, a relative, published a book accusing Cadbury and other chocolate companies of hypocrisy. The scandal was enormous. Cadbury sued for libel and lost. The judge ruled that yes, technically the book's claims were defamatory, but they were also true. Cadbury had been buying slave-grown cacao for years, while claiming to be an ethical company. It was the biggest crisis in the company's history, and George Cadbury's response defined how the company would handle moral failure for the next century. He didn't deny it. He didn't make excuses. He admitted they had failed, and then he changed the supply chain. Cadbury stupid buins são tomecação. They shifted to the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, where labor conditions, while still colonial and exploitative, were not outright slavery. They started investing in direct trade relationships with cacao farmers. They pushed for transparency in sourcing, and they used the scandal as proof that even well-intentioned companies could be complicit in systems of exploitation, that you had to constantly examine your supply chain. That ethics required vigilance. Now, does that make it okay? No. Does it erase the years they spent profiting from slave labor? No. But it's important to understand that Cadbury didn't just ignore the problem and move on. They restructured their entire sourcing model because of it. And that's rare. Most companies, when caught doing something terrible, deny it until they can't anymore. Then make the smallest possible change and hope everyone forgets. Cadbury admitted fault and overhauled their system. But the lesson here isn't that Cadbury was perfect. It's that even the most ethical company in an unethical system is still part of that system. You can't escape it just by wanting to. You have to fight it constantly, and sometimes you lose. Now let's talk about war, because nothing reshapes a company like war, and Cadbury lived through two of them. When World War I broke out in 1914, Cadbury faced an immediate problem. Most of their workers were men of military age, and Britain needed soldiers. Cadbury could have resisted, could have argued their workers were essential to the war effort, but they didn't, because Quakers were pacifists. They didn't believe in war, but they also didn't stop their workers from enlisting. Hundreds of Cadbury employees joined the military, and George Cadbury promised every single one of them their job would be waiting when they returned. If they returned, the company also promised to support their families while they were gone. Widows, children, Cadbury kept paying. The factory shifted production. Chocolate for soldiers, rations, care packages. The government rationed sugar. Cacao imports dropped. And Cadbury, like every British company, had to shrink. But they didn't lay people off. They shortened hours, spread the work. And when the war ended in 1918, they kept their promise. Every returning soldier got their job back. Then came 1939. World War II. Even worse. Longer. Deadlier. More destructive. And this time, Cadbury's factory became a target. The Luftwaffe bombed Birmingham repeatedly. Bournville, being an industrial site, was hit. Workers were killed. Production was devastated. And once again, the British government rationed everything. Sugar, milk, cacao. Chocolate became a luxury the public couldn't access. But soldiers could. Cadbury produced millions of chocolate rations for British and Allied troops. The factory ran 24 hours a day. Women replaced the men who'd gone to fight. And Cadbury, despite the bombs, despite the shortages, despite the trauma, kept operating, kept paying wages, kept supporting families, kept Bournville running as a community. By 1945, when the war finally ended, Cadbury had survived. Barely, but they had survived. In the post-war years, as Britain rebuilt, Cadbury grew faster than ever. Because people wanted joy, sweetness, something to remind them life could be good again. And Cadbury gave them that. Dairy milk, cream eggs, roses. The purple wrapper became a symbol of comfort, of home, of a company that had been there through the worst and was still standing. But the world was changing. Empires were collapsing. Colonies were gaining independence. Global trade was opening up. And chocolate, which had once been a European luxury, was becoming a global commodity. Cadbury expanded. Australia, New Zealand, India, Africa. By the 1960s, Cadbury was operating on every continent. And in 1969, they merged with Schweppes, the beverage company, and became Cadbury Schweppes, a multinational corporation. And that's when everything started to shift. Because you can't be a family business and a multinational corporation at the same time. Not really. Not for long. Let's step inside the factory now. Not the modern one. Not the clean, automated version you might imagine. But the actual Bournville factory as it existed in 1881, just 2 years after it opened. Because if you want to understand what made Cadbury different, you need to smell it. Feel it. Walk through a day the way a worker would have walked through it. It's 6 in the morning. Still dark outside, especially in winter. You live in one of the new houses George Cadbury built. Brick, 2 stories. A front garden you're still not used to having. Because before this job, before Bournville, you lived in a Birmingham slum where 6 families shared one toilet in an alley and the air smelled like coal smoke and human waste every single day. Here, the air smells like grass. Like rain. You have a garden. A small one, but it's yours. You planted vegetables last spring. Carrots, potatoes, beans. Your children, and you have 4, all under 10, still sleep upstairs. Your wife is already awake, boiling water for tea. Not the expensive kind, the cheap kind, but it's still tea, and that's something. You eat bread, a bit of butter if you're lucky, maybe an egg. Then you walk. Not far, maybe 10 minutes. Because the factory is right there, surrounded by trees George Cadbury planted himself. You're not alone. Dozens of others are walking the same path. Men, women, teenagers, though not children, because Cadbury doesn't employ anyone under 13, which is strange because your last job had kids as young as 7 working the machines. You clock in, not with a punch card. Those don't exist yet. A foreman writes your name in a ledger. You're not late, so you don't get dock pay. At your last factory, if you were 5 minutes late, you lost half a day's wage. Here, you just get a look. You walk into the factory floor, and the first thing that hits you is the smell. Chocolate. Thick. Sweet. Overwhelming. You'll stop noticing it in an hour, but right now it's everywhere. The floor is clean. Not spotless. This is still 1881, but cleaner than any factory you've ever worked in. There are windows. Actual windows. Light comes in. You can see the sky. At your last job, you worked in a basement. No windows. Gas lamps. Air so thick with dust you cough blood by the end of every shift. Here, there are ventilation shafts. Someone thought about air. You take your position at one of the long tables. Your job is simple. You're packing chocolates into tins. It's repetitive. Your hands will ache by noon, but it's not dangerous. You're not operating a machine that could take your fingers. You're not carrying boiling liquid. You're not breathing in particles that will destroy your lungs in 5 years. You're packing chocolates, and every so often a supervisor walks by. Not to yell, not to threaten, just to check. At 9:30, a bell rings. You stop, because it's break time. 15 minutes. You're allowed to leave the floor. Walk outside if you want. There's tea, provided by the company. Not great tea, not the kind the Cadbury family drinks. But it's free, and you sit on a bench in the sun if the sun is out and you drink it. At your last job, there were no breaks. If you stopped working, you were fired. Here, they want you to stop. They think it makes you work better. And maybe it does, because you're not fantasizing about burning the place down, which is a significant improvement over your previous employment. You go back inside. The work continues. Packing, counting, sealing tins. Your hands move automatically. You talk to the woman next to you. Her name is Mary. She's been here since the factory opened. She tells you the Cadbury brothers walk through sometimes. Not to inspect, just to see. They know some of the workers by name. You don't believe her until it happens. 3 weeks later, George Cadbury himself walks onto the floor. Older man, Quaker dress, plain and dark. He stops at your table, asks how you're settling in, asks if the house is comfortable. You're so surprised you barely answer. He's not checking your work. He's asking if you're okay. You've never had an employer ask you that. Not once. At noon, the bell rings again. Lunch. 1 hour. You can go home if you want. The houses are close enough where you can eat in the dining hall they just built. There's soup, bread. It's not free, but it's cheap. Cheaper than you'd pay anywhere else. You sit with other workers. You talk, not about work, about normal things. Your children, the weather, the garden. Someone mentions the swimming pool they're building. You think they're joking. They're not. George Cadbury is building a swimming facility for workers because he thinks exercise is good for health. You've never been swimming in your life. You're 34 years old and you've never been swimming because swimming pools are for rich people. But apparently not here. After lunch, you go back. More packing, more counting. Your back hurts. Your hands hurt, but you're not injured. You're not sick. At 5, the bell rings. End of shift. 9 hours, including breaks. At your last job, you work 12, sometimes 14. You clock out. Walk home. Your children are playing in the street, which is safe here because there are no carriages racing through, no factories dumping waste, no danger. Just a quiet road lined with trees. Your wife has dinner ready. Potatoes, vegetables from the garden, sometimes meat if you can afford it, and you can more often than before, because Cadbury pays weekly, in cash, enough that you're not choosing between rent and food. After dinner, you sit outside. You're tired but not destroyed. You can still think, still talk. Your children are healthier here. They're not coughing all the time. The baby, the one born last year, is still alive, which feels like a miracle because in the slum, half the babies born on your street died before they turned 2. Here, there's a doctor, a real one. Cadbury employs him. If your children get sick, you can see him. You don't pay. The company does. You've heard there's going to be a dentist too. You've never seen a dentist. You're missing 3 teeth and the rest hurt. But maybe your children won't have to lose theirs. You go to bed early because you're tired, but it's a good tired, not the kind that makes you want to die, the kind that makes you feel like you did something, like you're part of something, and tomorrow you'll wake up and do it again, and the day after that, and the day after that, for years, maybe decades, because people don't leave Bourneville, not because they can't, because they don't want to. This is what the familiar version of the story misses. Bourneville wasn't just a business strategy. It was a lived experience. For thousands of people, it was the difference between survival and dignity, between exhaustion and life. And it wasn't perfect. The work was still hard. The pay, while fair, wasn't lavish. You were still working class, still poor by any reasonable standard, but you weren't being destroyed. And in 1881, in industrial England, that was revolutionary. Now let's talk about a specific object. Something small. Something you've probably never thought about. But something that tells the entire story of Cadbury in a single, physical form. A tin. Not just any tin. A Cadbury's cocoa tin. Cylindrical. About 6 inches tall. Maybe 3 inches across. The label wrapped around it, printed in rich colors, deep red, gold, sometimes purple even in the early years. The Cadbury name in bold serif letters. An image, sometimes of the factory, or a royal crest, after Cadbury earned the right to use one as an official supplier to the Queen. Inside, cocoa powder. Fine, dark, absolutely pure, or at least that's what the label promised. And that promise, that small printed claim, was the foundation of everything. Because in the 1880s, when these tins first appeared in British homes, most cocoa was not pure. It was cut with flour, starch, brick dust, anything cheap that could add weight. Food adulteration was rampant. Milk was watered down and whitened with chalk. Bread was stretched with sawdust. Candy was colored with toxic dyes, lead-based pigments that poisoned children slowly. And cocoa, expensive cocoa, was routinely mixed with whatever the manufacturer could get away with. There were no regulations, no inspections. If you were poor, you ate poison and you didn't even know it. But Cadbury's cocoa was different. The tin said so. Absolutely pure, therefore best. And it wasn't a lie. George and Richard Cadbury had staked their entire reputation on purity. When they launched Cadbury Cocoa Essence in 1869, they made it the purest cocoa available in Britain. No additives, no fetus, just cocoa. And they put that promise on every tin, which meant that if you were a working-class mother in 1875, trying to feed your children something that wouldn't kill them, and you saved up enough money to buy a tin of Cadbury's cocoa, you were buying more than a drink. You were buying trust. You were buying the belief that someone, somewhere, wasn't trying to cheat you. That belief was worth more than the cocoa itself, and the tin became a symbol of it. People kept the tins. Long after the cocoa was gone, they used them to store things. Buttons, coins, nails. Yeah, a Cadbury tin in your kitchen wasn't just practical. It was proof you'd been able to afford something good, something real. And Cadbury knew this. They designed the tins beautifully. Collectible, even. Some had illustrations. Scenes of the Bourneville factory surrounded by gardens. Images of happy workers, which, okay, was definitely propaganda, but it was aspirational propaganda. It suggested a world where workers could be happy, where labor didn't have to mean suffering. By the early 1900s, Cadbury tins were everywhere. In working-class homes, middle-class homes, wealthy homes, the design changed over the decades. Art Nouveau borders in the 1910s. Streamlined Art Deco in the 20s and 30s. Wartime austerity designs in the 40s. Simpler, less color because resources were scarce. Then the explosion of post-war optimism in the 50s. Bright, cheerful, modern. But the core remained the same. The Cadbury name, the promise of quality, the suggestion that this company, unlike so many others, could be trusted. And here's the thing about that tin, that small, mundane object. It survived. Long after the cocoa inside was consumed, the tin remained. Passed down, reused, forgotten in attics, and rediscovered decades later. There are Cadbury tins from the 1880s still in circulation. You could buy them in antique shops. People collect them, not because they're valuable, though some are, but because they're tangible. They're proof that Cadbury was real, that the story, the village, the values, all of it was real. And when Kraft bought Cadbury in 2010, one of the first things they changed was the packaging. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly. The tins became cheaper, lighter, flimsier. The designs became more generic. The sense of craft, of care, started to disappear. And people noticed, because the tin wasn't just a container. It was a promise. And when the promise started to feel hollow, people felt betrayed. Not because the chocolate tasted different, though eventually it did, but because the tin told them something had changed. That Cadbury was no longer Cadbury. It was just another brand, owned by people who didn't understand what the tin meant, what had always meant. Now I need to talk about who got to live in Bournville and who didn't, because the story of Bournville, the way it's usually told, makes it sound like a worker's paradise open to everyone. And that's not quite true. Bournville was selective, very selective. George Cadbury didn't just build houses for any worker who needed one. He built them for the right kind of worker, the respectable kind. Let me be specific. If you were a Cadbury employee and you wanted to live in Bournville, you had to apply. And your application was reviewed. Not just your employment record, your character. They wanted to know, did you drink? Did you go to church? Was your home clean? Were your children well behaved? Did you have a reputation for honesty, thrift, discipline? If the answer to any of those questions was no, or even uncertain, you didn't get a house. You could still work at the factory, but you lived somewhere else. Now, George Cadbury would have told you this wasn't cruelty. It was care. He genuinely believed that environment shaped morality, that if you put good people in good homes, they become better. But if you let in people who drank, who were rough, who didn't share Quaker values, they'd corrupt the whole community. So Bournville wasn't just a village. It was a moral project, an attempt to create a model community of model citizens. And that meant exclusion. If you were poor but messy, you were out. If you were poor but angry, you were out. If you were poor but didn't believe in God or believe in the wrong God, you were out. Bournville was for the deserving poor. The ones who worked hard, kept clean, didn't complain, and accepted middle-class values as universal. Everyone else could stay in Birmingham. And here's the uncomfortable truth. This was normal. Progressive, even for the time. Because most social reformers in the late 1800s believed poverty was partly a moral failure. That poor people needed to be taught how to live properly, how to budget, how to clean, how to behave. The idea that poverty might be structural, that people might be poor because they were being exploited, not because they were lazy or ignorant. That idea was still radical. George Cadbury believed in helping the poor, but he also believed the poor needed improvement. And Bournville was the laboratory. Now, let's be fair. Compared to the alternatives, Bournville was extraordinary. Most workers in industrial England lived in slums where disease, violence, and despair were daily realities. Bournville offered safety, health, dignity, if you could get in, but the selection process created a hierarchy. Bournville workers versus non-Bournville workers. The respectable versus the rough. The chosen versus the excluded. And that divide shaped the culture of Cadbury for generations. If you lived in Bournville, you were proud. You were part of something. You had a garden, a community, a future. If you didn't, you were just a factory worker. You did the same job, earned the same wage, but you didn't get the swimming pool, the doctor, the sense of belonging. You got a paycheck. And over time, resentment built. Not loudly, not violently, but quietly. Because Bournville's existence was a constant reminder that some workers were deemed worthy of care and others weren't. Now, let's talk about gender. Because Bournville had very specific ideas about men and women. Men worked in the factory. Women did too, but only until they got married. Once you were married, you were expected to leave, to stay home, raise children, keep house. Cadbury didn't fire married women, exactly, but the culture strongly discouraged them from working. Because George Cadbury believed a woman's place was in the home, that children needed mothers, that a man should earn enough to support his family alone. And in a way, that was progressive, because it implied men should be paid a living wage, enough that their wives didn't have to work. But it also meant women had no economic independence. If your husband died, you were financially ruined. If your husband was abusive, you were trapped. If you didn't want to marry, you had limited options. You could work at Cadbury, but only in certain roles. Packing, sorting, light assembly, not management, not skilled trades, not decision-making. Women were workers, but they were temporary workers, placeholders until they became wives. And Bournville reflected that. The houses were designed for families. Father, mother, children, the ideal nuclear family. If you didn't fit that model, single mother, widower, unmarried woman, Bournville didn't quite know what to do with you. You could live there sometimes, but you were an exception, an anomaly. And the community, kind as it tried to be, made you feel it. Then there's class. Because even within Bournville, there were divisions. Managers lived in bigger houses. Supervisors had better plots. Factory floor workers had the smallest homes, though still far better than anything they'd had before. The Cadbury family didn't live in Bournville. They lived in manor houses, estates. They visited Bournville, walked through, smiled, but they didn't live there, because Bournville was for workers. And the Cadburys, no matter how kind, no matter how progressive, were not workers. They were owners. And that gap, that fundamental divide between the people who owned the factory and the people who worked in it, never closed. Couldn't close, because Bournville, for all its idealism, was still a capitalist enterprise. George Cadbury owned the land, owned the houses, owned the factory. Workers rented, workers labored, workers benefited, yes, enormously, but they didn't own. They didn't control. They didn't decide. And when decisions were made that affected their lives, they had no vote, no voice. They could appeal to the Cadbury family's sense of fairness. And often that worked, but it was an appeal to kindness, not a claim of right. And that's the hidden truth of Bournville. It was a benevolent dictatorship, kind, generous, well-meaning, but still a dictatorship. The Cadburys decided who lived there, what the rules were, what moral standard applied, and workers, grateful as they were, had to accept that, or leave. Most stayed, because even with its limits, its exclusions, its paternalism, Bournville was still better than anything else available. But it was never a worker's paradise. It was a controlled experiment in moral capitalism. And the control was always in the hands of the people who owned everything. Here's what you probably believe about Cadbury: that it was family-owned until 2010, when Kraft bought it. That for over 150 years, the Cadbury family controlled the company, protected its values, and kept it independent. That the 2010 takeover was a sudden betrayal, a corporate raid that destroyed a family legacy in one brutal transaction. And that narrative, the one repeated in every news article, every documentary, every outrage comment section, is wrong. Not completely wrong, but wrong enough that it hides the actual story. Because the Cadbury family lost control of Cadbury decades before Kraft ever appeared. They lost it slowly, quietly, through a series of decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but ultimately guaranteed the company would eventually be sold. Let me show you how. In 1962, Cadbury merged with Schweppes, the drinks company. The new entity was called Cadbury Schweppes, and it went public, meaning, for the first time in the company's history, shares were sold on the open market. Anyone could buy them. Institutional investors, pension funds, hedge funds, people who didn't care about Quaker values or worker welfare or Bournville's gardens, people who cared about returns. Now, the Cadbury family still held significant shares. They still had board seats. They still influenced decisions, but they no longer had absolute control. And once you go public, Once you invite outside shareholders into your company, you've started a clock. Because public companies have one legal obligation above all others: maximizing shareholder value. Not worker welfare, not community benefit, not ethical sourcing. Shareholder value. And if the Cadbury family wanted to make decisions that prioritize values over profit, they had to justify those decisions to investors who didn't share those values. Every year, that got harder. In 1969, Cadbury Schweppes bought Peter Paul, an American candy company. In 1978, they bought Sunkist. In the 80s and 90s, they kept expanding. Australia, India, South Africa. Cadbury Schweppes became a multinational conglomerate. Massive, profitable, successful by every financial metric, but also increasingly not really Cadbury anymore. The board was full of non-family executives, professional managers with MBAs, not Quaker principles. Decisions were made in boardrooms in London, not in Bournville. And the workers, the community, the values that had defined Cadbury for a century, those became complications. Expensive complications. Because Bournville was costly to maintain. The sports facilities, the medical care, the pensions, the promise that no worker would be laid off without cause, the policy of paying above minimum wage. All of that cut into profit margins. And investors started asking, why? Why pay workers more than you have to? Why maintain facilities that aren't legally required? Why prioritize long-term community stability over short-term gains? And the Cadbury family, still on the board, still influential, would say, because it's the right thing to do. Because it's what we've always done. Because our reputation depends on it. And for a while, that argument worked. Cadbury's reputation was valuable. The brand was beloved. Consumers trusted it. That trust translated to sales. So investors tolerated the extra costs. But they didn't like it. And they waited. Then, in 2008, Cadbury Schweppes split. The beverage business, Schweppes, Dr. Pepper, 7-Up, all of that was spun off into a separate company. What remained was just Cadbury. Pure confectionerie. Smaller, more focused, and suddenly more vulnerable. Because a smaller company is easier to acquire. And Cadbury, now independent again, was enormously valuable, profitable, global, iconic, but it was also publicly traded, which meant anyone with enough money could buy it. And in 2009, Kraft Foods, the American food giant, decided to try. Now here's what's important to understand. Kraft didn't launch a hostile takeover because Cadbury was failing. Cadbury was thriving. Record profits, growing market share. But Kraft CEO, Irene Rosenfeld, saw an opportunity. If Kraft bought Cadbury, they'd gain access to emerging markets where Cadbury was dominant. India, Africa, Southeast Asia. They'd acquire beloved brands. Dairy milk, cream egg, roses. They'd eliminate a competitor. And they'd unlock synergies, corporate speak for cutting costs by firing people and closing facilities. So in September 2009, Kraft made an offer. £10.2 billion. Cadbury's board rejected it, said it undervalued the company. Kraft raised the offer. Cadbury's board rejected it again. The British public was furious. This wasn't just a business transaction. Cadbury was a national institution, a symbol of British manufacturing, British ethics, British identity. The idea of an American corporation known for processed cheese buying Cadbury felt like a violation. Politicians condemned it. Workers protested. The media called it a betrayal. And Cadbury's board tried to fight. But here's the thing about hostile takeovers. If you're a publicly traded company and someone offers enough money, your shareholders can force you to sell, even if the board objects. even if the workers object, even if the entire country objects. Because shareholders own the company, not the board, not the workers, not the public. Shareholders. And Kraft kept raising the offer. 11.5 billion, 11.9 billion. Finally, in January 2010, enough shareholders accepted. Cadbury's board had no choice. The sale went through. Kraft owned Cadbury, and immediately, within days, Kraft broke its first promise. During the takeover bid, Kraft had promised to keep the Somerdale factory near Bristol open. They'd said it publicly, repeatedly. It was one of the key reassurances that convinced some shareholders to approve the sale. The factory employed 400 people. It made dairy milk bars. It had been operating for 90 years. 7 days after the acquisition finalized, Kraft announced Somerdale would close. Production would move to Poland, where labor was cheaper. 400 people lost their jobs. The British government was outraged but powerless. Workers were devastated, and the public realized what had happened. Cadbury hadn't been saved. It had been bought, stripped, and optimized. Everything that made Cadbury different, the commitments to workers, to communities, to values over profit, all of that was now subject to the priorities of a corporation that didn't care. And here's the misconception I need to break. People say Kraft destroyed Cadbury, that the takeover was the moment everything went wrong. But the takeover was just the final step. The real destruction happened decades earlier, when Cadbury went public, when a family gave up control, when they allowed the company to become a commodity that could be bought and sold. They did it for good reasons: to raise capital, to expand, to compete globally. But the cost was control. And once you lose control, you can't protect your values. You can only hope the people who replace you will care. And in 2010, the people who took control didn't. Not because they were evil, but because they were playing a different game. A game where Bourneville, with its gardens and swimming pools and pensions, was just an expensive inefficiency. A relic, something to be managed down quietly over time until no one remembered it had ever been different. And that's exactly what happened. Let's talk about what it felt like to work at Cadbury. Not the policies, not the buildings, the rituals, the small, repeated actions that made Cadbury feel like more than a job. Because humans don't bond over mission statements. They bond over routines, over things done the same way, day after day, until they stop being tasks and become traditions. At Cadbury, there were dozens of these. Some official, some informal, but all of them mattered. Every morning before the shift started, there was a moment of silence. Not prayer exactly. Cadbury was Quaker, and Quakers don't do formal prayers. But silence. A minute, sometimes two, where the factory floor was completely still. No machines, no voices, just quiet. It wasn't mandatory, but almost everyone participated, because it was a reset, a breath, a reminder that before you were a worker, you were a person. And that person deserved a moment of peace before the noise began. Then the machine started. The rhythm of the factory took over. Conveyor belts, mixers, packaging lines, a sound so constant it became like weather. You stopped hearing it as noise and started hearing it as presence. The factory was alive, and you were part of it. Mid-morning, the tea break. 15 minutes. The machine stopped. You left the floor. In the early years, tea was provided in large urns. By the mid-20th century, there was a canteen. You sat with the same people every day. Not because you were assigned seats, but because humans are creatures of habit. You had your table, your spot, and the conversations were the same, too. Weather, gardens, children, football, Nothing deep, nothing urgent, just the small, steady exchange of lives lived in parallel. And that repetition, that sameness, wasn't boring. It was comforting, because it meant tomorrow would be like today, and today was okay. At lunch, if the weather was good, people ate outside, on benches near the gardens, near the trees George Cadbury planted in 1879, some of which were still standing 100 years later. You could see them from the factory floor. Oak, ash, beech, huge, old, patient. And there was something stabilizing about that. Knowing those trees had been there before you, will be there after you. That the factory, for all its machinery and modernization, was still connected to something slower, something rooted. Then back inside, the afternoon shift, longer than the morning, harder. Your body was tired, but the rhythm carried you. The repetition, hand to conveyor, check, pack, repeat, hand to conveyor, check, pack, repeat. It sounds numbing, and sometimes it was, but there was also a meditative quality to it. Your mind could wander. You could think about dinner, the garden, the weekend, or you could think about nothing. Just hands moving, chocolate passing, time flowing. And at 5 o'clock, the bell. Not a harsh buzzer. A bell. Deep. Clear. You stopped. Machines stopped. And for a moment, the factory was silent again, the way it had been in the morning. A bookend. You clocked out. Walk home. If you lived in Bourneville, the walk was short. 5 minutes. 10. And along the way, you saw neighbors. People who worked the same shift, walked the same route every single day. You nodded. Maybe spoke. Good shift. Not bad. Small exchanges. Predictable. But that predictability was the point. Because life outside the factory, life in Birmingham, in industrial England, was chaotic, uncertain. But inside Cadbury, inside Bourneville, there was order. Not the oppressive kind. The kind that made you feel held. On Saturdays, if you wanted, you could use the sports facilities. The bowling green, the cricket pitch, later, the swimming pool. These weren't just amenities. They were rituals. Weekly gatherings where workers became teammates. With a factory hierarchy dissolved, at least a little, a manager and a floor worker could be on the same cricket team. Not equals, exactly, but closer. And those games, those Saturday afternoons, they built something. Not friendship always, but familiarity. A sense that you were all part of the same thing. Then there were the annual events. The summer fete, held on the factory grounds. Games for children. Food. Music. Everyone came. Workers. Families. The Cadbury family, in the early years, attended too. Not as lords observing peasants, but as participants. George Cadbury judged the garden competition, walked through rows of vegetables workers had grown, gave prizes, shook hands, and for one day, the distance between owner and worker felt smaller. Of course, it wasn't really smaller. George went home to a manor. Workers went home to terraced houses. But the ritual mattered, because it suggested that the relationship was more than transactional, that the company cared, even if that care had limits. At Christmas, there were bonuses. Not huge, but reliable. Every worker got something, a little extra money, sometimes a gift. In the early years, a box of Cadbury chocolates. Later, as the company grew, the bonuses grew too. But the principle remained. Christmas wasn't just a holiday. It was a moment when the company acknowledged your work, your presence, your worth, and you felt it. Not because the bonus was life-changing, but because it was expected, because it had always been done, because the ritual itself was the gift. Then there were the unofficial rituals, the ones workers created. Birthdays celebrated on the factory floor. A cake, if someone's wife or mother sent one in. Singing, badly during the tea break. Retirement parties. Not fancy, just a gathering. A speech. A gift, usually something small collected by coworkers. A watch. A pen. Something to mark the years. And the retiree often would cry. Not because the gift was valuable, but because it meant they'd been seen, that their decades hadn't gone unnoticed. All of these rituals, the daily ones, the weekly ones, the annual ones, they created a rhythm, a pattern, and that pattern became identity. You weren't just a Cadbury worker. You were part of Cadbury. It was in your routine, your week, your year. And when the company started to change, when new owners took over, when efficiency experts arrived with clipboards and started cutting things, the first things to go were the rituals. The tea breaks got shorter. The bonuses got smaller, then conditional, then discretionary. The summer fete stopped happening. The sports facilities were maintained less, then closed, then sold. And workers felt it, not as a loss of benefits, but as a loss of identity. Because the rituals weren't luxuries. They were the proof that Cadbury was different, that it cared. And when the rituals disappeared, so did that belief. Now let's talk about what it actually cost to make chocolate. Not in money, in bodies. Because for all of Cadbury's idealism, for all of George Cadbury's gardens and swimming pools and moral vision, the factory was still a factory. And factories, even the kind ones, were people down. Let's start with the most basic thing, standing. If you worked on the factory floor at Cadbury, you stood for hours, 8 hours, 9, sometimes more, depending on the era and the demand. You stood at a table or by a machine or on a line, and you did the same motion over and over. Packing chocolates, sorting them, lifting trays, moving boxes. Your feet hurt first, aching, swollen, throbbing. Then your back, lower back, usually from standing in the same position. Then your hands, repetitive strain, cuts from packaging, burns from hot chocolate. Nothing severe enough to stop working, but constant enough to remind you every single day that your body was being used. And over years, over decades, that use added up. By the time you were 50, if you'd worked at Cadbury since you were 16, your body was bent. Not metaphorically, literally. Shoulders curved, spine compressed, hands stiff with arthritis, feet ruined. You walked differently, slower, and you hurt. All the time. Now, compared to other factories, Cadbury was gentle. There were no massive industrial accidents, no explosions, no workers crushed by machines. The work wasn't dangerous in the dramatic sense, but it was hard, and it was relentless, and your body paid for it. Then there's the air. Inside the factory, especially in the early years before ventilation systems improved, the air was thick, with cocoa dust, with sugar, with heat from the machines. You breathed it in all day, and over time, it damaged your lungs. Not catastrophically, not like coal dust or asbestos, but enough that older workers coughed. Constantly. A dry, persistent cough that never quite went away. And in winter, when the factory was cold despite the machines, and you walked home through freezing rain, that cough became bronchitis, became pneumonia, became the thing that killed you at 62, decades before you should have died. Now, Cadbury provided medical care. A doctor, a nurse, later, a dental clinic. And that was extraordinary. Most workers had no access to health care. If you got sick, you just stayed sick or died. But Cadbury's medical care, while real, had limits. The doctor could treat cuts, infections, minor injuries, but chronic pain, arthritis, lung damage from years of factory air, there wasn't much he could do. You were told to rest, to take it easy, but you couldn't rest, because if you didn't work, you didn't get paid. and you had a family to feed. So you kept going, through the pain, through the exhaustion, until your body just gave out. Let's talk about pregnancy. Because if you were a woman working at Cadbury, pregnancy ended your employment. Not officially, not always, but culturally. Once you were visibly pregnant, you were expected to leave, to go home, prepare for motherhood. And if you wanted to come back after the baby was born, you could try. But there was no maternity leave, no guarantee of your job. You left, and someone else took your place. And if you needed the income, if your husband's wage wasn't enough, you were stuck. You could take in laundry, sewing, piecework you could do at home. But factory wages were gone. And childbirth itself, even in the 20th century, even in a progressive place like Bournville, was dangerous. Women died. Not often, but regularly enough that every worker knew someone who hadn't survived childbirth, or whose baby hadn't. Infection, hemorrhage, complications no doctor could fix. And if you survived, if your baby survived, your body was different, weaker, and returning to factory work, standing for 8 hours, lifting, bending, it was harder. Your body had been through something immense, and there was no time to recover. You just went back. Then there's aging. Most factories in industrial England had no pensions. When you got too old to work, you were fired, and you either relied on family, where you starved, or you ended up in a workhouse. Cadbury was different. They provided pensions, not generous ones, but enough to survive. If you'd worked at Cadbury for decades, you could retire at 60, sometimes earlier if your health failed, and receive a small monthly payment. Enough for rent, food, not comfort, but survival. And that was revolutionary, because it meant old age wasn't automatic destitution. You could stop working, rest, live your last years without terror. But here's what the pension didn't cover: dignity. Because by the time you retired, your body was broken. You'd given Cadbury 30, 40 years, and you had nothing left. You couldn't garden the way you used to, couldn't walk far, couldn't lift your grandchildren without pain. You traded your body for a wage, and the wage had been fair, yes, better than most, but your body was still gone, and no amount of pension could give it back. Now let's talk about fear. Not the fear of machines or injury, but the fear of losing your job. Because even at Cadbury, even in the most ethical factory in Britain, that fear existed. Cadbury didn't fire people casually. They didn't lay off workers for minor infractions. But if the economy contracted, if sales dropped, if costs had to be cut, jobs disappeared. And if you lost your job at Cadbury, you lost everything. Your house, if you lived in Bournville, your community, your identity. You'd go back to Birmingham, back to the slums, back to the kind of work that destroyed people. So you lived with a low-grade anxiety, a constant awareness that your security depended on the company's goodwill. And goodwill, no matter how genuine, could always be withdrawn. You worked hard, stayed quiet, didn't complain, not because you were oppressed, but because you were grateful. And grateful people don't make demands. They endure. And endurance over decades has a cost. It lives in your body, in your silence, in the things you never said because you were afraid of losing what you had. And when you finally retired, when you finally stopped, you carried all of that with you. The pain, the exhaustion, the fear. It didn't go away. It just became your life. The price you paid for a fair wage and a garden. By the 1970s, the world Cadbury had built itself around was disappearing. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, inevitably, because the entire framework of industrial Britain, the world that made Bournville revolutionary, was being replaced by something new. Let's start with the obvious shift: globalization. In 1879, when George Cadbury built Bournville, manufacturing was local. You grew cacao in one place, shipped it to Britain, processed it in a British factory, sold it to British consumers. The entire chain existed within a few thousand miles. By the 1970s, that chain had stretched across the entire planet. Cadbury was buying cacao from Ghana, sugar from the Caribbean, milk from local British farms, but also increasingly from wherever was cheapest. The factory itself, once singular, once centered entirely at Bourneville, was now one node in a global network. Cadbury had factories in Australia, in India, in Nigeria, each one operating under different labor laws, different economic pressures, different cultural expectations. And here's what happened when a company goes global. The values that worked in one specific place, in one specific context, become harder to maintain everywhere. Bourneville worked because it was built by a specific family, in a specific religious tradition, in a specific British context, with specific legal and economic conditions. You couldn't just copy and paste that model onto a factory in Lagos or Mumbai or Sydney. Local conditions were different. Labor laws were different. Cultural expectations were different. And so, gradually, the Cadbury way became less a universal principle and more a nostalgic ideal, increasingly confined to the original site in Britain, while the rest of the empire, this expanding global chocolate empire, operated under more conventional corporate logic. Then there's industrialization itself, evolving in ways George Cadbury never anticipated. When Bourneville was built, the technology was still relatively simple. Mixing, molding, wrapping, mostly done by hand, assisted by basic machinery. By the mid-20th century, automation had transformed everything. Machines could do what dozens of workers used to do. Faster, cheaper, without breaks, without pensions, without gardens. And this created a brutal irony. The very efficiency that made chocolate cheaper and more accessible, the thing that let ordinary families afford a treat that had once been reserved for aristocrats, also made human workers less necessary. Cadbury had to automate to stay competitive, which meant, over time, fewer jobs. Fewer people needed at Bourneville. The factory that once employed thousands, that once defined an entire community, gradually needed fewer hands to produce even more chocolate. And the workers who remained faced a different kind of pressure. Not physical exhaustion in the old sense, but the anxiety of technological displacement. The knowledge that a machine might soon do your job better than you could. Then came the legal changes. By the 1940s, Britain had a welfare state, the National Health Service, state pensions, unemployment benefits, legal protections for workers. Suddenly, many of the things that made Cadbury exceptional, the medical care, the pensions, the safety standards, were now legally required for every company. What was once radical generosity became baseline expectation, and this created an identity crisis. If every company had to provide health care, if every company had to offer pensions, what made Cadbury special anymore? The moral distinctiveness that had defined the company for a century was being absorbed into general policy. Cadbury wasn't uniquely good anymore. It was simply compliant with the law like everyone else. And this mattered more than it might seem, because the entire justification for Cadbury's unusual approach, treating workers well because it was right, not because it was required, started to blur. Once the government mandated basic worker protections, the Cadbury family's original moral argument, that businesses had an ethical duty beyond profit, became less visible, less distinctive, just normal. Then came Thatcherism. In the 1980s, Britain underwent a radical economic transformation. Margaret Thatcher's government pushed deregulation, privatization, and a fierce belief in free market competition. The entire cultural mood shifted. Where once there had been at least some public respect for companies that prioritized worker welfare, now the dominant ideology celebrated efficiency, profit, shareholder value above all else. Unions, which had grown powerful throughout the mid-20th century, were systematically weakened. The idea that businesses had social responsibilities beyond their shareholders was increasingly treated as naive, even foolish. And Cadbury, trying to survive in this new environment, faced pressure to modernize, to cut costs, to behave more like every other publicly traded company. The Cadbury family, still present on the board, still trying to protect the founding principles, found themselves increasingly outnumbered, outvoted. Their voice, once dominant, now one among many. Professional managers, trained in the new orthodoxy of shareholder primacy, took control of day-to-day decisions. And slowly, without any single dramatic moment, the company began prioritizing quarterly earnings over long-term community investment. Meanwhile, consumer culture was changing too. In the 19th century, buying Cadbury chocolate meant something. It was a statement about quality, about trust, about supporting ethical manufacturing. By the late 20th century, chocolate had become a commodity. Consumers compared prices, compared taste, compared convenience. Few people buying a dairy milk bar at a corner shop in 1985 thought about Bournville, about Quaker ethics, about the moral weight behind the purple wrapper. They just wanted chocolate. And Cadbury, competing against Nestle, Mars, Hershey's, had a focus on marketing, taste, price, not moral philosophy. The brand story became a secondary consideration, trotted out occasionally for nostalgia, but no longer the central organizing principle of the business. And then came the final transformation, financialization. By the 1990s and 2000s, the global economy had shifted dramatically toward finance. Companies weren't just judged by their products or their profits. They were judged by stock performance, quarterly reports, analyst predictions, shareholder expectations. A company like Cadbury, no matter how beloved, no matter how historically significant, was now primarily a financial asset, something to be bought, sold, leveraged, optimized. The people making decisions about Cadbury's future increasingly weren't chocolate makers. They were financial analysts, investment bankers, hedge fund managers, people who saw Bournville not as a moral achievement, but as an underutilized asset with excess costs that could be trimmed for better returns. And this is the world Cadbury existed in by 2009, when Kraft made its first offer. Not a world where ethical business was rewarded, but a world where ethical business was viewed as an inefficiency waiting to be corrected. The world hadn't just changed around Cadbury. It had changed against everything Cadbury represented. And the company, no matter how strong its history, no matter how loyal its workers, no matter how beloved its brand, could not escape the gravity of that transformation. Now, let's talk about what happened to the Cadbury story after it became history. Because once something becomes nostalgic, once it becomes heritage, people start to reshape it, simplify it, sanitize it, sell it back to you in a form that's easier to digest, but less true. And Cadbury's story has been through this machine thoroughly. Let's start with tourism. Today, you can visit Cadbury World. It's an attraction in Bournville, opened in 1990, designed to tell the story of chocolate and Cadbury's history. And it's charming, genuinely. There are exhibits about cacao, about the history of chocolate, about the Cadbury family. Children love it. But here's what it doesn't tell you. Cadbury World barely mentions the Sao Tome slavery scandal. It doesn't dwell on the exclusionary selection process for Bourneville housing. It doesn't explore the messy reality of losing family control in 1962. It doesn't discuss at all the 2010 Kraft takeover in any critical depth. Instead, it presents a streamlined narrative. Friendly Quaker family invents delicious chocolate, builds nice village. Everyone lives happily. The end. Buy a chocolate bar on your way out. This isn't necessarily malicious. Tourist attractions simplify. They're designed for families, for a pleasant afternoon, not for rigorous historical analysis. But the effect is that millions of visitors leave with an incomplete, overly rosy picture. They learn about the swimming pools and gardens. They don't learn about the moral complexities, the labor exploitation in the supply chain, the eventual corporate betrayal. Then there's branding. Kraft, and later Mondelez, which spun off from Kraft in 2012 and now owns Cadbury, has continued using nostalgic imagery. A glass and a half of full cream milk. Images of the English countryside. References to tradition, heritage, quality. But the actual manufacturing process has changed dramatically. In 2015, Mondelez altered the recipe for dairy milk, replacing some cocoa butter with vegetable fats, cheaper to produce, to comply with EU regulations that no longer required the same cocoa butter content for products labeled chocolate. Consumers noticed a difference in taste and texture. Many complained the chocolate felt cheaper, waxier. Nostalgic branding continued, even as the actual product diverged further from what it once was. This is a common pattern in corporate history. The story gets frozen at its most flattering moment, while the actual company keeps evolving in less flattering directions. Then there's the internet's version of history. Search for Cadbury history, and you'll find dozens of listicles, video essays, social media posts. Most focus on trivia. Did you know Cadbury invented the Easter egg? Did you know the purple color is trademarked? Fun facts, shareable content. But rarely do these pieces engage with the deeper moral complexity, the slavery scandal, the exclusionary housing policies, the eventual corporate betrayal. Because nuance doesn't perform well on social media. Simple narratives, good company or evil company, get more engagement than complicated truths. And so the popular understanding of Cadbury oscillates between two extremes. Either uncritical nostalgia, wasn't it lovely, or reflexive cynicism, capitalism ruins everything, without much space for the Messier reality in between. The reality where a company could be genuinely progressive for its time while still being embedded in colonial exploitation. Where a family could sincerely care about workers while still enforcing paternalistic control. Where a corporate takeover could be both a betrayal of specific promises and also somewhat inevitable given decades of structural decisions. That complexity doesn't fit neatly into a tweet or a TikTok video. Then there's the way Cadbury has been used in political and economic debates. Politicians across the spectrum invoke Cadbury's history to support opposing arguments. Conservatives point to it as proof that free markets and private enterprise can produce ethical outcomes without government intervention. Look, they say, a private company chose to treat workers well without being forced to. Progressives point to the eventual Kraft takeover as proof that unregulated markets always prioritize profit over people eventually. See, they say, even the most ethical company gets devoured by capitalism if left unprotected. Both sides use selective parts of the history to support predetermined conclusions. Neither fully grapples with a complicated truth that Cadbury's ethical success required a very specific set of conditions: a committed family with religious conviction, private ownership, a particular historical moment, and that those conditions were not sustainable once the company entered public markets. It's not proof that capitalism inherently produces good or bad outcomes. It's proof that specific structures, specific ownership models, specific accountability mechanisms matter enormously in determining whether ethical business practices can survive. Then there's the emotional afterlife of the brand itself. For many people, especially in Britain, Cadbury chocolate carries deep nostalgic weight. It's associated with childhood, with holidays, with comfort. The purple wrapper triggers memories of Christmas stockings, Easter mornings, small treats after difficult days. This emotional resonance is real and valuable, but it's also been exploited. Marketing campaigns deliberately trigger this nostalgia, associating the brand with warmth, family, tradition, even as the actual company operates according to entirely different, more ruthless corporate logic. You're buying a feeling, a manufactured feeling, in some ways disconnected from the current reality of who owns the company and how it operates. And when people learn about the actual history, the slavery scandal, the exclusionary practices, the corporate betrayal, they often feel a strange sense of loss. Not just historical disappointment, but personal betrayal, because the nostalgia was so deeply tied to identity, to childhood memory, that learning uncomfortable truths feels like losing something personal. This is why stories like this one matter. Not to destroy nostalgia entirely, but to complicate it, to hold both truths simultaneously. That Cadbury did something genuinely remarkable for its time, and that this remarkable achievement was fragile, imperfect, and ultimately unable to survive contact with modern shareholder capitalism. The real story is messier than either the tourist attraction version or the cynical takedown version. And that messiness, that complexity, is actually more interesting, more human, more worth remembering than either simplified narrative. Despite everything, the Cadbury story persists. The brand still exists. The Bourneville factory still operates, though under Mondelez's ownership now. The purple wrapper is still recognized worldwide. So why did this story survive when so many other historical business narratives fade into obscurity? Let's think through this carefully. First, flexibility. Cadbury, throughout its history, adapted constantly while maintaining core symbolic elements. The specific products changed: drinking cocoa, solid chocolate bars, cream eggs, roses, twirls, but the brand identity remained consistent. The purple color, the glass and a half symbol, the sense of quality and tradition. This flexibility allowed the company to survive massive technological and market changes without losing brand recognition. Even after Kraft's acquisition, even after recipe changes, even after factory closures, the core brand identity persisted because it had been built on flexible, adaptable symbolism rather than rigid, unchangeable specifics. Second, usefulness. Chocolate itself serves a consistent human need across centuries: pleasure, comfort, celebration. Whether it's an Aztec ritual drink or a modern candy bar, chocolate satisfies something deep in human psychology. This underlying usefulness means the product category itself, chocolate, will likely never disappear, regardless of who owns specific brands. Cadbury benefited from being attached to a product with permanent human demand. Third, emotion. As discussed, Cadbury chocolate is deeply tied to personal and cultural memory, for millions of people. Childhood Easter eggs, Christmas stockings, small comforts during difficult times. This emotional attachment creates loyalty that transcends rational business analysis. People continue buying Cadbury not just because it's convenient or tasty, but because it connects them to memory, identity, tradition. Emotional attachment is incredibly durable, often surviving corporate changes, recipe alterations, even ethical controversies. Fourth, memory and story. The Cadbury narrative itself, the Quaker family, the utopian village, the moral experiment, has become part of British cultural memory. It's taught in schools, discussed in business ethics courses, referenced in documentaries. This narrative power gives Cadbury a cultural significance beyond its current corporate reality. Even people who've never visited Bournville, never studied Quaker business ethics, have absorbed fragments of this story through cultural osmosis. And stories, once embedded in cultural memory, are remarkably resilient. They get retold, reshaped, but rarely forgotten entirely. Fifth, identity. For many British people, Cadbury represents something about national identity. British manufacturing prowess, British social reform tradition, British quirky combination of capitalism and conscience. When Kraft acquired Cadbury, part of the public outrage stemmed from this perceived loss of national identity, not just economic concern. This connection between corporate brand and national identity gives Cadbury cultural weight that transcends simple commercial value. People feel protective of Cadbury because it represents something about who they believe themselves to be as a nation, as a culture. Sixth, commerce. Simply put, Cadbury remains profitable. Despite controversies, despite recipe changes, despite ownership shifts, people continue buying Cadbury products in massive quantities. This continued commercial success ensures the brand's survival, regardless of ethical debates or historical controversies. Capitalism, whatever its flaws, tends to preserve what remains profitable, and Cadbury chocolate remains extremely profitable. Seventh, power. Mondelez, as a massive multinational corporation, has enormous resources to maintain and promote the Cadbury brand globally. Marketing budgets, distribution networks, retail partnerships, all of this institutional power ensures Cadbury products remain visible, accessible, and culturally present. Even if the ethical foundations have shifted dramatically, the corporate power supporting the brand ensures its continued visibility and relevance. Eighth, community. Even now, Bournville itself, the physical village, still exists. People still live there. The houses are still occupied, though many are now privately owned rather than company-controlled. The gardens still exist. Some community traditions persist in modified forms. This physical continuity provides tangible connection to the original vision, even as the company that created it has changed ownership multiple times. This combination of factors, flexibility, usefulness, emotion, memory, identity, commerce, power, community, explains why Cadbury survived as both a commercial entity and a cultural narrative, even as its original ethical foundations were systematically dismantled. The brand outlived the values that created it. The story outlived the family that lived it. And this, perhaps, is the most important lesson embedded in Cadbury's survival. Brands and stories can persist independently of their original moral content. They can be preserved, marketed, sold, and beloved, even after the substance that made them meaningful has been hollowed out. This isn't unique to Cadbury. It's a pattern that repeats throughout history. Wherever commercial interests intersect with cultural memory, and human emotion. The form survives. The function changes. And most people, most of the time, don't notice the difference because the form itself, the purple wrapper, the familiar taste, the nostalgic association, is powerful enough to sustain belief long after the underlying reality has transformed completely. So what does all of this actually tell us about being human? Because underneath the chocolate, underneath the factories and takeovers and tins and gardens, there's something deeper happening here. Something that has nothing to do with cacao beans or shareholder meetings. It's about the oldest tension human beings have ever faced. The tension between what we believe and what the world allows us to sustain. George Cadbury believed, with his whole heart, that kindness could be structural, that you could build systems, not just individual acts of charity, but entire systems, factories, villages, economies, based on care rather than exploitation. And for 100 years, he was right. Not perfectly right, not without contradiction, without exclusion, without complicity in larger systems of harm, but right enough that thousands of lives were genuinely, measurably better because of what he built. Children who didn't die of preventable disease. Workers who lived into old age with dignity instead of collapsing under labor at 50. Families who had gardens instead of slums, medical care instead of suffering, security instead of terror. That happened. It was real. And it matters that it was real, even though it eventually ended. Because here's the thing about human goodness. It doesn't have to be permanent to be meaningful. We often think that if something good eventually fails, eventually gets corrupted or sold or dismantled, that failure retroactively erases the goodness. As if only permanent things count. As if temporary kindness is somehow fake kindness. But that's not true. The relief that a Bourneville mother felt when her child survived infancy because of clean water and medical care that wouldn't have existed elsewhere, that relief was real in that moment. It doesn't become less real because 70 years later, a different family, sitting in a different boardroom in Illinois, decided that swimming pools were an inefficient use of capital. The two things exist on different timescales. Individual human experience happens in the present. Institutional decay happens over decades, sometimes centuries. And we, watching from a distance, from the vantage point of history, tend to judge the entire arc as one story with one verdict, success or failure, good or bad. But that's not how humans actually live. We live in moments, in days that either have dignity or don't, in choices made now that either honor human worth or diminish it. George Cadbury made those choices for himself and for thousands of workers for 100 years. That's not nothing. That's not erased by what happened afterward. But here's the second truth, the harder one, the one that sits uncomfortably alongside the first. Individual virtue is not the same as systemic protection. You can be a good person running a good company, making good choices for decades, and still be unable to prevent your life's work from being dismantled once you're gone. Because goodness, unless it's structurally protected, unless it's embedded in law, in ownership models, in enforceable rights rather than voluntary generosity, remains vulnerable. Vulnerable to succession. Vulnerable to market pressure. Vulnerable to the simple fact that the people who come after you might not share your values, and nothing you did during your lifetime can force them to. This is the real lesson of Cadbury, more than any specific fact about chocolate or Quakers or corporate takeovers. It's about the limits of individual moral will in the face of systemic forces. George Cadbury could build gardens. He could not build a legal structure that would guarantee those gardens survived his family's direct control. He could pay fair wages. He could not prevent future shareholders from deciding fair wages were optional. He could create a culture of care. He could not transfer that culture permanently into the DNA of a publicly traded corporation, because corporations legally exist to generate returns for shareholders, and culture, however deeply embedded, can always be overridden by that legal mandate. This isn't a reason for cynicism. It's a reason for clarity. If we want institutions to protect human dignity long term, we can't rely solely on the goodwill of whoever happens to be in charge at any given moment. We need structures, laws, regulations, ownership models that distribute power rather than concentrating it. Because individual kindness, no matter how genuine, no matter how sustained, eventually meets its limit when it collides with systems designed to prioritize something else. And there's a third truth here too, quieter than the first two, but maybe the most human of all. We keep trying anyway, despite knowing or suspecting that our best efforts might not survive us. Despite understanding that the gardens we plant might be paved over, that the values we teach our children might not be inherited by the institutions we build, we still try. We still build. We still choose kindness in the moment, even when we can't guarantee its permanence. Because the alternative, doing nothing, choosing cruelty or indifference because kindness might not last, that alternative is worse. George Cadbury knew, on some level, that his empire might not remain exactly as he envisioned forever. Companies change, markets shift, people die and are replaced by people with different values. But he built Bournville anyway. He planted those trees anyway. He paid fair wages and provided health care and created gardens anyway. Not because he was naive about permanence, but because the present mattered, even without a guarantee about the future. This is perhaps the oldest human truth there is. We build sandcastles knowing the tide will come. We raise children knowing they'll grow up and make their own choices separate from ours. We create art, write books, build companies, plant gardens, all while knowing somewhere in the back of our minds that nothing we make is truly permanent. Everything erodes eventually. Every institution, no matter how well-intentioned, will eventually face pressures that test its founding values. And sometimes those values will bend, break, get sold for £11.9 billion to a company that closes your favorite factory within a week. But the moments of genuine care that happened before that ending, they still happened. They're still true. They still counted for the people who lived inside them. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be enough. Because it's all any of us can really offer. Goodness in the present, without guarantee of permanence. Kindness now, without certainty about later. Care today, even knowing tomorrow might undo it. That's not weakness. That's not naivety. That's simply what it means to be human, trying to build something meaningful inside a world that promises nothing will last forever. It's late now. Wherever you are, whatever time zone holds you right now, the day is likely done or nearly done. And maybe, like the workers we've been walking beside tonight, you're tired in that particular way that comes at the end of something long. Let's slow down together. Let's return, gently, to the image we started with. A purple wrapper, a glass and a half of milk. Something so ordinary you've probably touched it 1,000 times without thinking. But now you know what lives inside that ordinary object. You know about a man who opened a tea shop because he believed kindness could be sold, one cup at a time, as an alternative to despair. You know about two young brothers who nearly went bankrupt because they refused to cut corners, refused to exploit children, refused to add chalk and flour and lies to what they sold. You know about a garden built where a factory should have been. Trees planted in 1879 that are probably still standing right now, tonight, in the darkness outside Birmingham, older than anyone who remembers why they were planted. You know about swimming pools built for people who had never been taught to swim, about pensions given to people who expected nothing, about a family that tried, imperfectly but genuinely, to prove that profit and dignity could coexist. And you know how it ended. Not with a villain twirling a mustache, but with spreadsheets, with shareholders voting on numbers, not values, with a factory closing 7 days after a promise was made to keep it open. This is how most things end, isn't it? Not with dramatic betrayal, but with quiet, procedural disappointment. Someone breaks a promise not because they're evil, but because the system they operate within doesn't require them to keep it. Think about the seasons for a moment. Think about how a garden works. You plant something in spring, not knowing exactly how it will grow, not knowing if frost will come early, if pests will arrive, if drought will stunt the harvest. You plant anyway, because that's what gardens require. An act of faith performed in the present, without guarantee about the future. George Cadbury planted a company the way you plant a garden, with hope, with intention, with as much care as he could offer. And for 100 years, that garden grew, bloomed, even in ways that surprised everyone who thought kindness and commerce couldn't coexist. And then, like all gardens eventually do, it changed hands. New owners came. Different priorities took root. Some of what was planted got cleared away to make room for something else. This isn't unique to Cadbury. This is the pattern of everything that exists in time. Everything we build knowing somewhere in the quiet corners of our minds that we won't control what happens to it forever. Parents raise children knowing those children will grow into adults who make their own choices. Writers publish books knowing readers will interpret them in ways the writer never intended. Communities build traditions knowing future generations might abandon them or transform them into something unrecognizable. This is simply what it means to create something that outlives the moment of its creation. You lose control, eventually, inevitably, and there's a strange peace available, if you can find it, in accepting this. Not resignation, not defeat, but peace. The peace of understanding that your job, while you're here, while you have influence and agency in time, is simply to plant well, to care for what's growing for as long as you're able, and then eventually to let go. Because you have to, because that's the nature of time, of mortality, of institutions that outlive their founders. The workers who walked through Bourneville's gates each morning for decades, they didn't know how the story would end. They just knew how their day would go. Wake up, walk to work, stand at the table, pack the chocolates, breathe the sweet, thick air, take tea at 9:30, eat lunch under old trees, work until 5, walk home, see neighbors, eat dinner, sleep, repeat, for years, for decades. And in that repetition, in that daily faithfulness to small tasks and small kindnesses, they built something together that mattered. Even though none of them controlled how it would ultimately end. Even though none of them could have predicted a boardroom in Illinois deciding their factory's fate with numbers on a screen. They just showed up, did their work, lived their days with whatever dignity was available to them. And that dignity, however temporary, however eventually undermined by forces beyond their control, was real. It happened. It mattered. Just like your day mattered today, regardless of what tomorrow holds. Just like the kindness you offered someone this week counts, regardless of whether they remember it next year. Just like the effort you put into anything, work, relationships, small acts of care, has value in the moment it happens, independent of whether it lasts forever. This is the quiet truth hidden inside a chocolate bar's history. Not a lesson about capitalism, exactly, though there's plenty to learn there, but a lesson about time, about impermanence, about the strange, necessary courage required to build something meaningful anyway, even knowing it might not survive intact. The trees George Cadbury planted are still growing somewhere in Bourneville tonight, taller than he ever saw them, rooted deeper than he ever knew, still there, regardless of who owns the factory beside them, still growing, slowly, patiently, indifferent to boardroom decisions and shareholder votes. Maybe that's the image to hold on to as you drift towards sleep tonight. Not the takeover, not the broken promise, but the trees. Old, patient, still standing, still offering shade to whoever walks beneath them, regardless of what's changed around them. Let's go back, one final time, to where we started. A purple wrapper, a glass and a half of milk poured into every bar since 1928, when the company first added that image to remind people what real milk, real quality, actually looked like. You know the whole story now. You know about John Cadbury's tea shop, opened because he believed, perhaps naively, perhaps beautifully, that kindness could compete with despair. You know about Richard and George, young men who nearly lost everything because they refused to compromise their values, and who eventually built something extraordinary because they refused to give up. You know about Bourneville, the gardens, the swimming pools, the pensions, the doctors, the trees. You know it wasn't perfect. You know there was exclusion, paternalism, complicity in systems of harm that even good intentions couldn't fully escape. You know about the slavery scandal and how the family responded not with denial, but with genuine, if delayed, reform. You know about the wars, the promises kept even when keeping them was hard. You know about 1962, when the company went public and control began slipping away, slowly, quietly, decades before anyone noticed the cost. And you know about January 2010, 11.9 billion pounds, a promise broken within 7 days. 130 years of careful, deliberate difference, absorbed into a system that measures everything, ultimately, in numbers rather than gardens. So here's the final question, the one worth sitting with as you drift towards sleep tonight. Was it worth it? Was it worth building something that beautiful, knowing it would eventually be dismantled? Was it worth all that care, all that intention, all that stubborn insistence on doing things differently if the end result was just another acquisition, another spreadsheet, another factory closed for efficiency? I think the answer is yes. Not because the ending justifies the beginning, but because the beginning didn't need the ending to justify it. The lives that were better because of Bourneville, they were better. Full stop. Not better forever. Not better in a way that changed the fundamental trajectory of global capitalism, but better for the people who lived those specific lives in that specific place during those specific decades. A child who didn't die of preventable illness because of clean water and medical care, that child grew up, had a life, maybe children of their own, maybe grandchildren, a ripple that continued long after Bourneville itself changed ownership, changed purpose, changed meaning. The good that happened doesn't get erased by what happened afterward. It just becomes part of a larger, more complicated story. One where nothing is purely triumphant and nothing is purely tragic. Just human beings trying their best within the limits of their time and understanding to build something meaningful, and failing eventually in some ways, but succeeding powerfully in others. This is true of every institution, Every company, every family, every tradition passed down through generations. Nothing survives unchanged. Everything, eventually, gets reshaped by forces beyond the control of whoever built it. But that doesn't mean the building was pointless. It means the building was human, temporary, imperfect, but real. So the next time you unwrap a piece of chocolate, maybe not even Cadbury, maybe some other brand entirely, think about this for just a moment. Think about how something so small, so ordinary, so easily consumed and forgotten can carry within it centuries of human struggle. Struggle to be ethical, struggle to survive, struggle to balance kindness with sustainability, values with practicality, individual conscience with systemic pressure. Every product you touch has a history like this, if you look closely enough. Every ordinary object contains extraordinary complexity, extraordinary human effort, extraordinary compromise. We rarely think about it. We can't really. Life would be unbearable if we constantly traced every object back to its full moral complexity. But every so often, it's worth pausing,